Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this webinar in which I'm going to talk about the origin of spiritual literacy and also the spiritual alphabet. I'm Marianne Brussat, and I am the co-founder of Spirituality in Practice and also the co-author with my husband of the book Spiritual Literacy. I want to start by reading one of my favorite passages. I have lots of favorite passages from the book, but this one is from Frederick Frank. And I chose it partly because the virtual background that you see behind me is a statue that was created by the artist Frederick Frank. This is St. Francis and the birds, and it's actually outside our house here in Claremont, California. So I'm accompanied today by St. Francis and his many, many birds. So this is a passage from Frederick Frank from his book, Fingers Pointing Toward the Sacred. I was 5 and lying in high grass. A bee hummed close to my eye and frightened me. Then the bee started to suck honey, and at that very moment, I became sun, bee, flower, and grass. Me had evaporated with my fear. Then when I was 11 on a country road, I saw a snow flurry approach from afar. The first few snowflakes fell around my feet from the dark wintry sky. I saw how some of the flakes melted immediately on impact and others stayed. Again, me disappeared, melted with snowflakes, became one with road and sky and snowstorm. It has happened often, always when least expected. A few hours before leaving on this journey, driving somewhere in New Jersey, I lost my way back to the parkway. At last, at a traffic stop, stood a pedestrian, a very fat man in a battered Homburg hat. A greasy cigar stump stuck out straight from what looked more like a snout than a face. "How do I get to Route 4? I called out. "Route 4, he repeated, chewing on his cigar. "Nothing to it." His little eyes twinkled with kindness. "Take a left at the second light, can't miss it." He had put his fat hand on my sleeve and gave a friendly squeeze. I looked at him and saw. I tried to thank him, but no sound came. I made a kind of bow. The jelly had become man. What is spiritual experience? A snowflake melting, a bee sucking honey, a fat man at a traffic light. Trivia. So again, that's Frederick Frank. And what he's doing here is he's practicing spiritual literacy. Because spiritual literacy is the ability to see the signs of the presence of the sacred in your everyday experience. And what he's done here is he saw it as a child. He saw it, in a snowflake, in a bee, in a pedestrian at a street corner. And we have looked at that kind of experience discovered in all kinds of books that we reviewed, in all kinds of movies that we had watched. And we identified that there was a spiritual way of looking at the world, a spiritual perspective on the world. So the origin story of this book and of what we've done since is that we got a book contract based upon some articles we had done for one of our early newsletters on examples of spiritual perspectives on animals and on places and on things. And we decided to put together a compilation of short passages that illustrated this spiritual perspective on life, short takes they were. And the way it works, since Frederick, my husband, is the reader in the family, he would read all these books and go through all these passages and pages that he'd copied out. And he would come to me and he would say, "I think this should go in the book." And he would read me these passages and I would say, I admit this, that sometimes I just didn't get it. And I would say, oh, that is really, really, really well written. And I love that author, but why is this spiritually literate? And he would say, because it's expressing wonder, or this writer is talking out of gratitude, or it's about a transformative experience. So I began to just write down all these words that were coming up in these conversations. And before long, we had a list of 37 of them. And we organized them as an alphabet and went off to our publisher and said, we're going to put this alphabet in the book. And of course, the publisher said, well, an alphabet is 26 letters and you can't have 37. And we said, well, you try to choose between joy and justice, or you try to choose between play and peace, or teachers and transformation. So eventually we won the point, and we ended up with 37 qualities, practices that we call the alphabet of spiritual literacy, that if you look for these in your experiences and in what you're reading and watching, you will be looking from a spiritually literate perspective. Now, so Frederick wrote a couple pages on each one. He went through all of our quotes and found illustrations to define each one. And those went in the spiritual literacy book. We also wrote another book in which we did a chapter on each one of them. So that book is called Spiritual RX. And then when we launched our website in Spirituality and Practice, we decided that we would code every piece of content on the site according to which practice or practices from the alphabet it illustrated. So what we've ended up with is a huge reservoir on the website of illustrations of these 37 practices. And what we learned as we were doing that coding and working with this as almost a template on our own experience over the years, we discovered that we had a multi-faith perspective going on here. We talk in the book about how in medieval times, the Christian monks used to have a practice called reading the book of the world, in which they would look for signs again and identify it. We know that in Native American tradition, someone might go out into the woods and look for sign, look for messages from Great Spirit about what's something that they're looking for. Or in Islam, there's a wonderful passage in the Quran about how everything that happens to you is a letter from God. So this idea that you can read your experiences as spiritual messages, as spiritual statements, as spiritual perspectives is in all of the traditions. So we found that as we were working along, but we also discovered that you could call these practices, you could also call them character qualities, qualities of heart and mind. So something like beauty or the kindness. If you think about people that you probably consider to be spiritual or religious, these things will come to mind. So we sometimes call these qualities of heart and mind, we sometimes call them practices, but what we know about them is that they are experiences that people have. They're not abstract ideas. You can, this is the place where they're easily accessible, and it's where the tire hits the road. This is things that happen to people. So we kind of, one of the phrases that we started using and have still used is the idea that all of life is spiritual, and everything you do can be a spiritual practice. And so just think about it. If you look at everything that happens to you as, say, a reminder or a reflection or a symbol or a sample of the divine, that's what we mean by spiritual literacy. So it's kind of like once we started to see the world this way, then we discovered that our other definitions of spirituality all fit as well. Spirituality has many definitions, and we explored some of them in the book, and we've explored them on the website. But we often hear it talked about as the search for meaning and purpose. We hear it talked about as a way of acknowledging that there is something more in life than you. And we also see it as a way of life. And that's pretty much the closest that we come. We have a definition from that we've often used from Brother David Steindl-Rast. And Brother David says that spirituality is where you come alive. So if you come alive playing golf, or if you come alive parenting, or if you come alive singing, or in prayer, that's where you're being spiritual. And so the idea is to find more ways and areas of your life in which you can come alive, and that will expand the arena of your spirituality. The other thing that I often think about with, if we're talking about a way of being in the world and a way of seeing the world, why is my normal way of seeing the world different when I see it through a spiritual lens? And this is kind of an out-of-date illustration, but there was a time when those of us who had cameras that we held in our hands would screw a lens on the front of it that was a haze filter, and you would look through at the picture, and you would see the same thing, but what you saw was clearer. It was probably more sharp. It was more appealing to you. And in a sense, that's what I think of as a spiritual lens. It's like it takes away the veils of distraction, the veils of well, distraction is a pretty good word, but just the veils of non-meaning, and so that you see to the heart of things. So that's part of what we look at when we look at spiritual literacy. There are two other important aspects of this that really have to do with the alphabet. One of them is the idea that the alphabet functions as a bridge. And first of all, it's a bridge between the traditions. So all of the religions have practices for gratitude. They have practices for transformation. They usually have practices for forgiveness. Some traditions put the emphasis on certain things more than others. So for instance, I would say Christianity, you often hear about faith, forgiveness, love. Judaism, you hear a lot about meaning, the practice of meaning. You hear a lot about play. In Islam, you hear a lot about devotion, and also the idea of who you are and your true self. So this can go on. So you could say that these are some practices are more common in certain traditions, and you may be more familiar with them depending upon what tradition you grew up with or currently practice. But they're all multi-faith practices. They're all something that you can find in all the traditions. And so talking about them, instead of say talking about, well, my tradition believes this, and we have these teachers, and we have these sacred rituals, and this is how we worship, but instead talking about, here's how we practice gratitude, here's how we practice beauty, recognize beauty, here's how we practice wonder, is a way for the traditions to reach out to each other. At the same time, the alphabet is a bridge to people who don't feel as if they are part of a particular tradition. They just don't affiliate with the tradition. They might call themselves atheist or agnostic or spiritual but not religious. Whatever it is, it's likely, however, that they are drawn to some of these practices. So for instance, 15 years ago, it seemed as if everybody was keeping a gratitude journal and writing down three things a day that they were grateful for. And it didn't matter what religion you were from, or if you had never even been exposed to a religion, you knew what that meant. You knew what that practice was about, and that it could be very meaningful. Well, the same thing is happening today with a lot of different practices, a lot of the attention practices that are coming out of the mindfulness movement, for example. And so the practices that we focus on are universally applicable to people with or without a tradition. In our own experience, we have found that these practices are bridges to the culture. And that's comes out of our experience of coding movies, for instance, and saying this movie is an illustration of the practice of love. Or lots of movies are about transformation. You start out in the beginning and this character's this way, and by the time they get the end of the movie, the character's acting this way. That character has been transformed. A lot of movies are about shadow. They're about that part of ourselves that we want to ignore or deny. And so it shows up in our horror movies or in our documentaries about what's happening in the world. You can see illustrations of shadow in a lot of places. So again, the alphabet functions as a bridge to those parts of the culture. And then, and that's a worldwide culture, by the way. It's not just US or North American culture. And finally, we did a project recently, we still work on it some, called Practicing Democracy, in which we were identifying spiritual practices that could strengthen, in this particular project's case, the American democracy. And what we discovered was that these practices were a way to bridge polarization, political and cultural divides. And let me give you an example. Say you're at dinner with, and you happen to be let's just say a very progressive person, or at least you think of yourself that way. And across the table from you is your uncle, who has entirely different political views than you do. Now, the thing is that both of you are sitting there at that table wanting the same thing. You want respect. You want to have your views listened to, not necessarily agreed with, but honored. And so you are working with and seeking and desiring the spiritual practices of listening, but also the spiritual practice of reverence, which we define as respect. So again, here's where these qualities that we've identified over the years and coded things to, they can also be very helpful when you're dealing with a polarized situation. So the bridges is one area where I really think there's value in understanding these practices. But another area is that they are responses to symptoms. So I would say that although we have many reasons to turn to spirituality, a lot of times the reason people come to spirituality is because some symptom has shown up in their life. And by that, I mean something like perhaps they've just gotten a diagnosis and they don't know how to deal with that. And so they turn to the resources of the spiritual traditions. Or maybe they're happy and they just really want to be intentional about expressing their gratitude. Maybe there's something like they're out on a nature walk and they're just blown away with wonder. So something happens, and what this person realizes is that the way they responded previously may not be enough. Maybe they want to do things differently. And so that would become a way in which they respond to a symptom. We have in the book and also on the website what we call the Spiritual RX prescription chart. And that goes down the list and it says, here's the list of the alphabet practices, and here's the experiences that it either enhances or balances. And we found that very helpful in just dealing with all kinds of situations with friends, with family, with our own selves as we're working on our own spiritual growth. So the idea that the alphabet can have that bridging function in life and in work, but also that it is responsive to real life situations that you could find yourself in. That's also important to know. I was years ago, I remember going to speak at a church we were living in New York City at the time, and this was a church in Connecticut. And I was talking to the minister beforehand, and he said, well, whatever you say, I was going to talk about spiritual literacy and spiritual RX. He said, just remember that the number one question that I get as a minister in this church is, please tell me what to do. And what he really said was, people want practices. They want to know how they can respond from their spirituality. And so what we have been doing in the way that we've approached the work on the website, the content on the website, the way that we have approached some of our online courses, and now our new training program, which is providing spiritual literacy certificates, in which you have, over the course of basically a 9-month program, you learn about each one of these alphabet practices and how you're given opportunities to reflect on them. You're given opportunities to read book excerpts that illustrate them, to watch movies that illustrate them, to talk with a cohort of friends about how these practices are showing up in their life, and then to hear every month from a pretty renowned, I would say, spiritual teacher who is an exemplar of one of these practices. You will be able to not only discover how they are already showing up in your life, but how you can bring them more to the forefront of your life and bring them into your work, into your friendships, into your family life. So that is really the purpose of this new training program, to basically say that not only is all of your life already an opportunity for spiritual practice, but you can deepen this practice. You can find additional ways. You can find new practices that might work better for you. You can really, and then you can bring that into any situation. And I'm talking about, we have people in the program who are retired and living in a care community, but it's been important to them as they are facing the last part of their life. We have people in campus ministry. We have people in spiritual directors, people from a lot of what I would say companioning professions. We're talking clergy, spiritual directors, chaplains, but also social workers, people in healthcare. These, because they're so universal, these practices can really be applied in a lot of different situations. So we invite you to take a look at the page describing the program and the details of it. Go to the website, and under the on the navigation bar, under the practices section, you'll see the list of all of the alphabet of spiritual literacy. You'll find material there for you that we've curated very carefully to illustrate each of these practices, and give it a try. And we really do hope that you will join us to create a community of people who not only are familiar with spiritual literacy, but are practicing it in their everyday life. Now, to end up, I have a little song for you. This was after we published the Spiritual RX book. A folk singer sent us this song, and he'd written a song about the alphabet of spiritual literacy, about the chapters in the book. And we are going to we're going to end this little time together with enjoying that song. So again, I thank you for being here with me. Certainly let us know if you have any questions about the certificate programs. We're always available and eager to talk to people about what has become very meaningful in our lives. So thank you.
Pay attention, walk with beauty. Being present, live your days. Show compassion, build connections. In devotion, make your praise. Love, enthusiasm, and faith. Grant forgiveness, share God's grace. Live with gratitude and share the hope that binds the human race. Hospitality is needed. Imagination brings us home. In your joy come seeking justice. For each one, not just for some. Display kindness as you listen. Love with love that never ends. Search for meaning as you nurture. Openness makes strangers friends. Foster peace and learn by playing. As you quest, may you revere. Welcome shadow, welcome silence. Teachers bring transformation near. Work for unity with vision. Wonder at the mystery. Yearn and follow your desires. Live God's Spirit zealously. God in things we love and cherish. God in places we hold dear. God in nature all around us. God in creatures far and near. God in ease and occupation. In our service, in our care. In our bodies and relations. In community we share. May we learn to read the sacred in our ordinary days. Not to separate or sever us from others their ways. Instead, eyes and ears to open, and our minds and hearts as well, to all places and all spaces where our God is pleased to dwell. To all places and all spaces where our God is pleased to dwell.